This has been a rough couple of weeks for a couple big games. Last week, Gearbox's Battleborn received its final update, which added skins and some other cosmetic elements, rebalanced character abilities, and added some bug fixes. Gearbox has now shifted their focus to development on Borderlands 3. At least that's what everybody's assuming, though there hasn't been any announcement regarding it. The Borderlands series is pretty much Gearbox's flagship. To talk about Battleborn, however, it's a game that was launched at a somewhat awkward time, May 2016. It was up against Blizzard's Overwatch, which has since become a billion-dollar franchise for Activision Blizzard. While both games have some similarities on the surface, both being objective-oriented team-based first-person action games, Battleborn seems to have greater diversity in character abilities and gameplay, and it's more reminiscent of traditional MOBAs, whereas Overwatch leans more towards traditional FPS in its gameplay modes. This week, Gigantic developer Motiga has been shut down by publisher Perfect World. In case you've not heard of Motiga, they released their MOBA, Gigantic, earlier in the year on the Xbox One and Windows. This game spent years in development and overcame so many hurdles to its release that it seems a shame that it's wound up where it is. See, Gigantic was announced in 2014 with a slick trailer in a market that was excited for it. You see, MOBAs were big business a few years ago. Back when Dota 2 and League of Legends hit it big, it seemed as though everybody suddenly had a MOBA in development. Everybody was vying to be the next big thing in the esports arena. Here's the thing about tossing your hat into a genre of multiplayer games with ever-changing metas. Most people only play one, maybe two if they're very different. For instance, I pretty much forgot about Dota 2 once I got into Overwatch, and while I took advantage of Battleborn going free in order to at least try it out, I didn't stick with the game because frankly, my multiplayer action game focus is still with Overwatch. While I will still occasionally pop in for a casual round of Awesomenauts, my attention is being held by a single game. So, guess what happens when the market is filled with a bunch of games with similar and engrossing mechanics that take a long time to learn? That's right, folks. Most of those games do not survive. Dawngate closed. Infinite Crisis suffered a crisis of incredibly finite profitability. Dead Island Epidemic dead in the water. Rise of Immortals Battle for Graxia certainly not living up to the first half of its name. Gigantic, at first, was a more traditional MOBA that was more about two teams making their way through a dungeon before fighting one another, as well as a massive boss creature. However, it turned out that the PvP element of the game was more engaging than just fighting the boss. Hence, the developers decided to make these bosses part of each team. To put this in some perspective, if you're a Dota 2 player, imagine if the goal was to get Roshan to leave his pit and join your team. That's what's going on in Gigantic. Now, the game's development was not without its challenges. Motiga ran out of cash early on in their development cycle, and they needed to forge a publishing deal with Microsoft in order to bring the game to Windows 10 and the Xbox One exclusively. In 2015, there were layoffs at the studio, and in February, Motiga was all out of money. Everybody was out of a job and laid off. And that was supposed to be the end. And yet, the next day, all the employees showed up, and development on Gigantic continued until the studio was bought up by Perfect World Entertainment, which allowed them to pay their employees and release the game. There's a fantastic article about the development of Gigantic over at PC Gamer which goes into depth on their struggles. We'll leave a link to it on our site for this episode of 1RBC Gaming Weekly if you'd like to read it. It seems that right now is not a great time for launching a multiplayer action game. Besides Battleborn and Gigantic, last week saw The Amazing Eternals fall victim to the axe. That game was being developed by Digital Extremes, the company behind Warframe. Now, The Amazing Eternals was still in closed beta when the announcement came of its shutdown. I hadn't even heard of the game before discovering that it was already dead. For some perspective, Digital Extremes' other game, Warframe, is the 4th most popular game on Steam. That they pulled this thing from the market before it could really go anywhere is telling of the nature of the market. Unfortunately for developer Motiga, it looks like nobody's going into work tomorrow. That said, since the game's in the hands of Perfect World, it will continue to run for the foreseeable future. Hopefully the developers over there don't wreck Gigantic's incredibly clever gameplay in order to turn it into some sort of pay-to-win cash cow. For the time being, it seems a little portentous that searching for Battleborn on Steam also brings up Gigantic. A sign of things to come? Perhaps. What do you think about Gigantic? Did you ever get to play it? And if so, what did you think? Hit us up on Twitter at OneRuleBeCool and share your thoughts. We'd be happy to share them on our next episode of 1RBC Gaming Weekly. This just in. Runic Games has shut down. The developer behind the Torchlight series as well as the recently released Hob. Personally, I'm sad about this one. I feel sorry for all the teams and games that went down this week, but I was just playing Hob earlier in the week. I'm making my way through it for a review, and I've got to say that even though I'm still early on in the game, it's really cleverly put together. It's a 3D platformer in which you play as a little robot guy. You're making your way through a post-apocalyptic world full of life that's being threatened by some sort of spreading pollution. I just love how the world of the game is so quiet and yet so alive. If you're familiar with Hayao Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky, know that this game has a somewhat similar vibe. It's weird, really. After 9 years of triumphs and struggles, Runic is just gone. Their legacy will live on, however, as the Torchlight games were well loved, and Hob, while not that popular among players, earned a fantastic critical reception. The studio may be defunct, but the games are not forgotten. It is worth noting that publisher Perfect World Entertainment also owns Runic Games. Essentially, they'll be holding on to their IPs and most likely a few employees, but for the most part, the studio itself is dead. The Runic Games office in Seattle is dark tonight. Over on Twitter, Runic Games co-founder Travis Baldry dropped some interesting facts about the history of the studio. Apparently, they were almost owned by PopCap at some point, and interestingly enough, Torchlight 2 was originally going to be an MMO. Dropping some trivia is an interesting way to memorialize one's body of work. Are you a fan of Torchlight or Hob, and if so, what do you think about the shutdown of Runic Games? Hit us up on Twitter at OneRuleBeCool, and we'd be happy to share your thoughts on our next episode of 1RBC Gaming Weekly.